Matt Balogh from McNair Ingenuity Research has 25 years experience trying to work out who is listening, watching, reading. He's worked with News Limited for many years, Quadrant Research, and then his own company, Ingenuity Research. So please welcome Matt Balogh to tell us about the future.
I'd like to thank Uncle Greg for your warm welcome to this Gadigal country, which we acknowledge. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. The first thing I need to say is that nothing our organisation is doing in this area is perfect at all. We're basically reaching out our hand and saying we're having a go at these measurements. Some we're doing better than others. And for those that are imperfect, our first comment is, come and help us. We really need to improve. In building up the research that we do, we've basically tried to build and are still building and ask you here today to help us build a panel of Aboriginal people across Australia who will participate in surveys. And that's what we've been doing. Most of the panel comprises mobile phone numbers, which are now increasingly reachable in the remote communities. Obviously, not at all perfect, but a start. So most of the research is done by telephone. We are doing some research amongst Aboriginal people who have formed an online panel with us as well, very, very early days. Just to give you a sense, this graph just shows you a profile of the people who participate in the survey by age, but it does give you an indication that, for example, older people, both living in regional and remote areas, are joining and participating in the surveys. Young 18 to 24-year-olds who are always hard to reach in surveys are on the panel and participating. We have a good distribution of both men and women. And there's a sense of the distribution geographically. Interestingly enough, you might look at that and think, oh, it looks pretty good in remote areas relative to the population size. But actually what we need is more representation in remote areas and in communities than in regional, so that we have a really good understanding of the incredible complexity, because you know better than I do, the variety of cultures, languages, and stations in those areas. Some of the things we're measuring, the base measure we do, which is similar to all our media, is fundamentally where the people are listening to the radio stations. There are some strong numbers, 42% listening to one or other of the Indigenous radio station broadcasts around Australia, more so obviously in Northern Territory, less so in the more urbanised areas such as New South Wales, as you can see there. Up to 63% in Northern Territory, which is really an enormous number, more than half generally. This is probably the most interesting, the reasons for listening. And if you just look at the blue bars and don't worry about the complexity of the graph, basically what you're seeing is that 93%, you could say everyone nearly, want to hear about their own people and their own community. They want to hear music that they're familiar with. Looking down to about the fourth item there, 84% say that they listen to Indigenous media, Indigenous radio stations because it makes me feel proud. 77% say that it makes me feel included. Just looking there at listening to mainstream media, commercial popular music stations. Now, that number is only just ahead of the local community station, 43%. If you thought about the average Sydney-sider, the proportion of people who listen to commercial radio would be vastly greater. So what we can see here is a really different profile. We have community stations just slightly behind the commercial stations amongst the Indigenous community. A very, very different profile, very different story in the metro centres. And conversely, we have here, this is from the community radio station, sorry, I was jumping ahead of myself before, based on 10,000 or so interviews a year that we do, the number of the general population who are listening to those Indigenous media and Indigenous stations. So in Queensland, you have nearly 200,000 listeners. It's a huge number. Something like 20% of Brisbane, if it were all in Brisbane. 500,000 in New South Wales. So there's many more, nearly 1 million in total, who are reached in total. If you do a quick calculation on that, it means that there's another audience again, the same as the Australian Indigenous population listening to this medium. So there are some numbers there, just very quickly some top-line numbers. There are many more available. Increasingly, the radio stations, community stations are learning to use these in the best way possible. So when you talk to Spots in Space, talk to ING, talk to the stations, you'll find that more and more of the accountability and the answers you need are there.